Should have kept your mouth shut at that hearing, church boy. This one's gonna stick.
That is not mine. I swear on my life, officers. I have never seen that before.
Well, look what we got here. Felony possession.
This incident took place back in 2017 in the gritty streets of Baltimore, Maryland. The bodycam footage and the corner store CCTV later dragged the ugly truth into the light for everyone to see. 3 officers thought they could plant evidence on a good man and walk away laughing. But those cameras caught every smug grin, every sly hand movement, and the raw, bewildered innocence of Keith Harlan, a man who lived for his community and his church. The humid night air carried the scent of rain, soaked asphalt, and distant barbecue smoke when the flashing lights first appeared in his rearview mirror. Keith Harlan was a 58-year-old African-American veteran with dark, weathered skin, a salt and pepper beard framing a strong jaw, and the solid build of a man who once lifted crates in the factory before it shut down. After his Army tours overseas, he came home to West Baltimore and poured everything into volunteering. He patrolled the blocks every evening, checking on elderly neighbors, talking sense to young boys hanging on corners, and standing tall at Mount Zion Baptist Church on Sundays. That night, the engine of his old sedan hummed softly as he drove past rows of brick row houses with peeling paint. The kids' laughter mixed with the low rumble of distant sirens. Keith kept his windows cracked, letting the thick air wash over him while his mind turned to the next community meeting where he planned to speak up once more about police overreach. Suddenly, 3 cruisers boxed him in near the corner of Fulton Avenue and Lexington Street. Red and blue lights sliced the darkness. Keith's heart slammed against his ribs. He muttered a quick prayer under his breath and pulled over slow and careful, hands visible on the wheel. The smell of exhaust from the cruisers mixed with the cool night breeze. Sergeant Carlos Ramirez stepped out first, stocky with pale skin and a tight crew cut, his bodycam light blinking red. Behind him came Officer James Thompson, tall and lean with a thin mustache, and young Officer Derek Hale, blond and eager with a cocky stance. Ramirez barked the order, "Step out of the vehicle." Keith obeyed, the rough pavement gritty under his shoes. The officers circled him like shadows. Ramirez demanded license and registration while Thompson and Hale began the search. Keith stood tall, voice steady despite the knot twisting in his gut. "Officers, I am just out here volunteering for the neighborhood, checking on families. You can see my church ID right there." But their eyes stayed cold. They ordered him to the hood of the car. The metal felt warm under his palms. Flashlights cut through the glove compartment and trunk. Keith watched, confusion rising like bile in his throat. One officer turned his back just enough while the others kept Keith distracted with questions about his route. Then the body cams and the nearby CCTV captured the moment that would later ignite nationwide fury. Thompson's hand slipped quickly from his own pocket. A small clear baggie landed deep in the glove box. The white powder inside caught the dashboard light. Ramirez pulled it out seconds later and held it up high. "Look what we got here." His wide, arrogant grin froze on every camera. That smirk of pure satisfaction contrasted sharply with Keith's face. Eyes wide in shock, mouth open in pure disbelief. "That is not mine," Keith shouted, voice cracking with raw desperation. "I swear on my church and my Army service. I have never touched that stuff in my life." Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. The cuffs clicked tight around his wrists, cold metal biting into skin. The officers shoved him toward the cruiser while their low chuckles echoed in the night. Inside the back seat, the world blurred. The radio crackled with codes. The smell of leather and stale coffee filled the tight space. Keith stared out at the passing row houses, his mind racing through memories of Iraq sandstorms and the promises he made when he came home. He had lost the factory job. He had buried friends on these same streets. Now his activism, those public speeches calling for fairness, had painted a target on his back. The officers up front joked about another easy caller. Their words dripped with the kind of prejudice the body cams recorded in every syllable. Keith's chest tightened with a mix of fear, rage, and crushing betrayal. His wife waited at home. His congregation counted on him. The kids he mentored looked up to him as proof that a black man could rise above the system. The cruiser sped away, sirens wailing once more. Keith's car sat abandoned under the streetlight. Neighbors peeked from windows, phones already recording. But the real proof sat silent in those cameras. The planted drugs, the deliberate bias, the arrogant smiles against one man's genuine innocence. When those tapes finally surfaced, they would expose everything. The question burned hot in the humid Baltimore night. Would this setup destroy Keith Harlan, the veteran, the church pillar, the neighborhood guardian? Or would the cold, hard evidence from the body cams and CCTV finally force the system to answer for its sins and tear open the department's darkest secrets? The arrest was only the beginning, and the storm that followed would shake Baltimore to its core. Keith Harlan grew up in the Sandtown, Winchester neighborhood of West Baltimore, where the row houses stood shoulder to shoulder like old soldiers refusing to fall. Born in 1959, he was the middle child of 5 in a family that scraped by on his father's steel mill paycheck and his mother's part-time cleaning jobs. The streets back then pulsed with Motown on porch radios, the sizzle of corner fry shops, and the constant rhythm of kids playing stickball until the streetlights flickered on. But even as a boy, Keith felt the weight of the system pressing down. Police cruisers rolled slow through the blocks, eyes scanning for trouble, that always seemed to find young black faces first. He enlisted in the Army at 19, right after high school, seeking a way out and a way up. Vietnam was winding down, but the Cold War kept sending men overseas. Keith served 2 tours in Germany and 1 in the early 80s in the Middle East, driving supply trucks through dust, choked roads while learning discipline, brotherhood, and the bitter taste of coming home to a country that often looked the other way. He returned in 1986 with medals pinned to his chest and nightmares that woke him sweating in the dark. The VA promised help that came too slow. Jobs in the factories dried up one by one as plants closed and moved overseas. By the 90s, Keith was piecing together work as a mechanic, a security guard, anything to keep the lights on for his wife Marlene and their 2 daughters. Marlene was his anchor, petite with warm brown skin, bright eyes, and a laugh that could cut through tension like sunlight. They met at Mount Zion Baptist in 1988 during a church picnic. She worked as a nurse at Johns Hopkins, coming home exhausted but never too tired to pray with him or listen when the memories got loud. Their home on North Carey Street was modest, linoleum floors, family photos on every wall, the smell of her fried chicken drifting through the screen door on Sundays. The daughters, Tamika and Latoya, grew up hearing their father's stories of service and sacrifice, and his growing anger at how the same system that sent him to war now treated his neighbors like enemies. In the early 2000s, Keith started volunteering more seriously. First, it was coaching youth basketball at the rec center, then mentoring at Risk Teens through the church's outreach program. By 2010, he was a fixture on the block, tall, broad-shouldered, always in a crisp polo shirt with the Mount Zion logo, clipboard in hand during community walks. He documented potholes, broken streetlights, and aggressive policing. He spoke at city council meetings, voice steady but firm, calling out racial profiling and excessive stops in black neighborhoods. "We pay taxes too," he would say. "We deserve respect, not suspicion." His words earned nods from the congregation and glares from some in the police department. Whispers spread that Keith Harlan was one of those troublemakers who needed watching. The pressure built slowly, tickets for minor infractions that white drivers in other parts of the city never got, unexplained visits from cruisers idling outside his house at night. Once, during a routine traffic stop in 2014, an officer searched his car without consent and found nothing, but left with a warning that felt more like a threat. Keith never backed down. He organized town halls, collected signatures for petitions, even partnered with local ACLU chapters to push for bodycam transparency. To his church family, he was a hero. To certain officers, he became a problem. By 2017, Keith's patrols had become routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, he drove the same grid, Fulton, Payson, Monroe, stopping to chat with Ms. Evelyn on her stoop, handing a bottle of water to young Marcus shooting hoops alone, reminding teenage boys to pull up their pants and stay out of trouble. He carried a small notebook, jotting license plates of cruisers that lingered too long, dates of stops he witnessed. His activism wasn't loud anymore. It was steady, persistent, like water wearing down stone. But that persistence had made enemies. The night of the arrest wasn't random. Earlier that week, Keith had testified at a hearing about a controversial stop and frisk policy still lingering in parts of the city. He named names, carefully, factually, describing patterns of harassment in Sandtown. Word got back. Sergeant Ramirez, who had been written up twice before for questionable conduct, took it personally. Thompson and Hale, younger and hungry to prove themselves, followed his lead. They had watched Keith for weeks, waiting for the right moment. When they saw his sedan cruising alone that humid August evening, they made their move. The planted baggie was an amateur hour. It was calculated, small enough to hide in a pocket, visible enough to ruin a life. The Bodycam audio later revealed their casual cruelty. "This'll shut him up," one muttered as the cuffs clicked. "Trouble, Maker thinks he's above the law." Keith heard every word through the partition. His stomach churned. This wasn't about drugs. This was payback for daring to speak. Back at the station, the booking process dragged on. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The smell of bleach and old sweat hung heavy. Keith sat handcuffed to a bench, staring at the scuffed linoleum, replaying the moment the baggie appeared. He thought of Marlene, waiting up, phone in hand, worry carving lines deeper into her face. He thought of the kids at church who called him Uncle Keith. He thought of the flag he saluted every morning on his porch. How could men sworn to protect turn so easily into predators? The evidence sat locked in property. The cameras held the truth. But in that moment, chained to a cold bench in a Baltimore precinct, Keith Harlan felt smaller than he had since basic training. The system he fought for overseas now turned its teeth on him at home. Yet deep down a spark refused to die. He whispered to himself the same verse his mother taught him decades ago. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." He clung to it like a lifeline. The tapes would surface eventually. Neighbors' cell phone videos would spread. Activists would rally. But first came the long night in Holding, the bail hearing, the headlines screaming, community volunteer arrested on drug charges. The city held its breath. Would Keith Harlan be crushed under the weight of a lie? Or would the truth hidden in those blinking red lights finally break free and demand justice? Type justice in the comments if you believe the system set him up from the start. Have you ever seen good people targeted in your own city? Drop your thoughts below. What drove 3 officers to destroy a man who only wanted to protect his own streets? The answer lay buried in years of resentment, whispered station house talk, and the kind of prejudice that festers when a black veteran refuses to stay quiet. Keith Harlan sat handcuffed to that cold metal bench in the precinct, the fluorescent hum drilling into his skull like the mortar rounds he once dodged in the desert. His mind raced backward through time, pulling him into memories that smelled of diesel fuel, hot sand, and the metallic taste of fear. Flashback hit him first. 1983. A dusty road outside Ramstein Air Base. Keith, 24, fresh, faced and proud in his uniform, had pulled a fellow soldier from a burning truck after an ambush drill gone wrong. The man lived. Keith got a commendation and a scar on his left forearm that still itched when the weather turned. Back home in Baltimore, he wore that scar like a badge of honor. Yet here he was, 40 years later, chained like a criminal for something he never touched. The irony burned hotter than desert sun. He whispered the same prayer his mother taught him in the row house kitchen. "Yeah, though I walk through the valley." The words caught in his throat. This valley felt deeper than any war zone. The officer's motives were no mystery once the full picture emerged later. Sergeant Carlos Ramirez had been passed over for promotion twice in the last 18 months. Each time the review board cited community complaints, and Keith Harlan's name appeared in 3 of those complaints. Ramirez's pale face would flush red every time the activist petitions hit the chief's desk. "That church boy thinks he runs this city," he had snarled in the locker room weeks earlier. Bodycam audio from unrelated stops later confirmed the pattern. Thompson and Hale, younger and still proving themselves, saw an easy win. Plant the bag, close the case, earn stripes, and shut up the loudest voice calling for reform. The trigger. Keith's testimony 4 days earlier at City Hall. He had stood in front of microphones, voice steady, naming Fulton Avenue stops where black drivers were searched at triple the rate. He never named Ramirez directly, but everyone in the department knew. The sergeant's eyes had narrowed in the back row. That night, the 3 of them made a pact over cheap coffee in the break room. Time to teach him a lesson. Keith's own thoughts spiraled in the holding cell. He pictured Marlene at home, pacing the linoleum floor he had laid himself, the smell of her lavender lotion still clinging to the pillow. She would be calling their daughters right now, voice trembling but strong. Tamika, 32, a schoolteacher in Atlanta, would drop everything. Latoya, 29, working nights at the hospital like her mother, would already be praying. Keith's chest tightened with guilt heavier than the cuffs. He had always told them the system could be changed from inside. Now the system had him inside. The shame tasted like copper on his tongue. A deeper trigger surfaced in the quiet hours before dawn. Years earlier, in 2009, Keith had witnessed Ramirez roughing up a teenage boy on the same corner where he now sat arrested. The boy was LaToya's classmate. Keith stepped in, calm but firm. Bodycam, less days back then. He filed a complaint. Nothing happened. Ramirez remembered. The hatred had simmered for 8 long years, growing each time Keith's church marches past the precinct. He thinks he's untouchable because of that collar, Ramirez had told the rookies. We'll show him collars, don't stop cuffs. But the real twist came when Keith later learned the full depth of the setup. It wasn't just revenge. Hidden station logs revealed Ramirez had been under internal investigation for missing evidence from previous busts. Small amounts of drugs vanishing from property lockers. Planting on Keith was not only payback, it was cover. If the activist went down hard, attention would shift away from the sergeant's own dirty hands. The other 2 officers followed because Hale owed Ramirez a favor after a bar fight cover-up, and Thompson simply wanted the overtime pay that came with a big collar. 3 men, 3 different reasons, 1 innocent life in the crosshairs. The system didn't just fail Keith Harlan that night. It used him as a shield for its own rot. Keith closed his eyes against the buzzing lights. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cold bench. He flashed again to basic training. Drill sergeant screaming in his face. You will not break. He had not broken then. He would not break now. Yet doubt crept in like fog off the harbor. What if the planted bag stuck? What if the cameras never saw the sleight of hand? What if his church, his family, his neighborhood turned away because the headlines screamed drug arrest before the truth could speak? Outside the cell, dawn crept over Baltimore's row houses. The same streets he patrolled now felt like enemy territory. His mind raced to the kids he mentored. Little Jamal on the basketball court who called him Pops. Ms. Evelyn who brought him sweet tea on patrol nights. Would they believe the lie? The fear clawed deeper than any war memory. This wasn't Iraq. This was home. And home was supposed to be safe. But even in that dark cell, a spark refused to die. Keith straightened his back, the same way he had in the desert when sandstorms blinded everyone else. He knew those cameras existed. He knew neighbors had filmed the stop. He knew the truth sat waiting in silicon and code. The officers thought they had won. They had no idea the real battle was just beginning. The precinct door buzzed open hours later. Bail was set high. Marlene arrived, eyes red but jaw set. She squeezed his hand through the bars and whispered the same verse back to him. Yet, as Keith walked out into the gray morning light, one chilling question hung in the humid Baltimore air. How far would the department go to protect its own when the body cams finally told the story no one wanted to hear? The escalation was coming, and it would explode far beyond one planted baggie. The escalation exploded the moment the 3 officers boxed Keith Harlan's sedan in on Fulton Avenue. Bodycam footage captured every second in brutal clarity, the red recording lights blinking like accusing eyes. The humid Baltimore night pressed in thick with the smell of wet pavement and distant gunpowder from earlier fireworks. Keith's hands stayed glued to the steering wheel, knuckles pale under dark skin, while Sergeant Ramirez's voice cracked like a whip through the open window. Driver, step out now. Keep your hands where I can see them. Keith's heart hammered so loud he could hear it over the idling engines. He whispered one last prayer, voice barely audible, and slowly opened the door. The pavement felt gritty and warm under his shoes as he stood tall, 6-foot frame casting a long shadow under the streetlight. Officer Thompson's body cam caught Keith's face first, eyes wide with genuine confusion, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool breeze. Officers, I'm just patrolling for the church. You can check my ID right here in the visor. But Ramirez stepped closer, stocky build blocking the light, his own body cam showing the slight smirk already forming at the corner of his mouth. Thompson and Hale flanked him, hands resting too casually on their belts. The CCTV from the corner store across the street recorded the whole dance in wide angle. 3 white officers circling one black veteran like wolves who already smelled blood. Step 1 played out exactly as the cameras later proved. Ramirez ordered Keith to the hood of the car. Metal still radiated daytime heat against Keith's palms. Spread your legs. The command cut sharp. Keith complied, breath steady but chest tight. Thompson's body cam angle showed his hand slip into his own pocket for less than 2 seconds while Hale kept Keith distracted with rapid, fire questions about his route. "You been drinking tonight? Any weapons?" Keith answered calm, voice deep and respectful. "No sir, nothing. I'm a veteran, Army, and I volunteer every week." But the CCTV caught the sleight of hand in crystal detail. Thompson's fingers sliding the small clear baggie from his pocket and dropping it deep into the open glove box when Keith's head turned. Step 2 hit like a freight train. Ramirez reached in, pulled the baggie out with theatrical slowness, and held it up to the body cam lights. The white powder sparkled under the flash. His face filled the frame, that arrogant grin stretching wide, teeth flashing. Well, look what we got here. Felony possession. Keith's head snapped around, eyes exploding with raw disbelief. The body cam audio picked up his voice cracking for the first time. "That is not mine! I swear on my life, officers! I have never seen that before!" The desperation poured out thick, sweat now streaming down his temples, mixing with the humid air. Neighbor cell phones from nearby windows started rolling too, adding more angles to the nightmare. Step 3 turned physical. Hale slapped the cuffs on hard, metal biting into Keith's wrists with a cold click that echoed on every recording. Thompson shoved him toward the cruiser, hand firm on the back of his neck. Keith's knees buckled for half a second, not from guilt, but from the crushing weight of betrayal. The smell of leather and stale coffee hit him as they pushed him into the back seat. Inside, the partition glass fogged with his breath. Ramirez leaned in close, voice low enough that only the body cam microphone caught it. Should have kept your mouth shut at that hearing, church boy. This one's gonna stick." The words landed like punches. Keith stared straight ahead, jaw locked, but inside his mind screamed. Years of service, years of prayer, years of protecting these same streets. And this was the thanks. The drive to the precinct dragged in heavy silence broken only by the crackle of police radio. Keith's thoughts raced wild. He pictured Marlene's face when the call came, pictured the kids at Mount Zion looking up at him with trust that might shatter. The cruiser hit every pothole on purpose, or so it felt, jarring his cuffed hands against the seat. Outside, Baltimore's row houses blurred past, places he had walked patrol just hours earlier. The officers up front laughed low. Thompson's body cam caught the joke. Another easy one. Betty folds by morning, but the CCTV at the station entrance recorded Keith's exit head high despite the cuffs, eyes burning with a mix of fury and unbreakable dignity. Inside booking, the fluorescent lights buzzed mercilessly. The smell of bleach mixed with old fear. They fingerprinted him rough, ink staining his veteran hands that once held rifles for his country. Keith kept repeating the same words, a voice steady for the camera still rolling. "I want to see my lawyer. This is a setup. The church knows I'm clean." Ramirez just smirked again, that same grin frozen forever on the body cam files. The contrast burned. 3 officers high, feving in the hallway, while one good man sat broken but not beaten on a cold bench. Yet right there in the middle of the chaos came the twist no one saw coming on the night of the arrest. A rookie dispatcher watching the live body cam feed in the control room recognized Keith from church. She quietly saved the raw files before they could be lost. That single act of conscience would later crack the whole case wide open. But in that moment, Keith felt only the weight of the system closing in. His church, his family, his neighborhood, all hanging by the thread of those blinking red lights. The nights stretched long and cruel. Keith sat alone in the holding cell, the taste of metal still on his tongue from biting back screams. Outside, word spread like wildfire through Sandtown. Phones lit up, prayers rose. But the real storm was still building. Type justice in the comments if you're furious at those smug grins on the body cams. Have you ever watched good men get railroaded right in front of your eyes? Tell me your city below. I read every single one. The immediate consequences hit Baltimore like a thunderclap the moment Keith Harlan's cruiser disappeared down Fulton Avenue. Marlene Harlan received the call at 11:47 p.m. Her phone lit up on the kitchen counter where she had been waiting with a cold cup of coffee. The voice on the other end was flat, official. "Your husband is in custody on felony drug charges." Marlene's knees buckled. The smell of the fried chicken she had kept warm for him still hung in the air. She dropped the phone, tears already streaming down her warm brown face. Not my Keith, she whispered to the empty house. Not after everything he gave the city. By midnight, the news had exploded across Sandtown, Winchester. Neighbors poured out of row houses, phones in hand, gathering under the same streetlight where the arrest happened. Ms. Evelyn, 83 and frail, stood in her housecoat shouting at the sky. "They took Uncle Keith!" The one who checks on us every week. Young Jamal dropped his basketball and started recording a shaky live stream that raced through the neighborhood in minutes. The air filled with angry murmurs and the distant wail of more sirens. Church members from Mount Zion began arriving, Bibles in one hand, protest signs in the other. The scent of night rain mixed with the sharp smell of fear and fury. Inside the precinct holding cell, Keith sat on the concrete bench, wrists still raw from the cuffs. The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry hornets. The smell of stale urine and disinfectant clawed at his nose. Every few minutes, the metal door clanged as another man was shoved inside. Keith kept his eyes on the floor, replaying the officer's smirks in his head. His mind screamed questions no one could answer. How many other good men had they broken this way? How many veterans came home from war only to be treated like enemies on their own streets? The cold seeped through his clothes and straight into his bones. He thought of his army boots in the closet at home, polished and waiting for the next parade. Now those same feet were locked in a cage. Marlene didn't sleep. She called Tamika in Atlanta first. Her daughter's voice cracked over the line. "Mom, I'm booking a flight right now." LaToya was already in the car, speeding from her night shift at Johns Hopkins, tears blurring the highway lines. The family group chat exploded with prayers and frantic messages. By 2 a.m., the daughters were at the house, hugging their mother while the television in the background showed the first blurry cell phone footage of the stop. The local news anchor called it a routine drug arrest, but the comments underneath burned with rage. People typed, "Sit up," and planted, before the sun even rose. The chaos spilled onto the precinct steps by dawn. 30 church members stood in a circle, voices rising in hymn and protest. "Free Keith Harlan," the chant rolled down the block like thunder. Officers watched from behind bulletproof glass, faces tight. Inside, Keith heard the noise through the thick walls. It gave him the first flicker of hope since the cuffs clicked. But hope mixed with terror. What if the planted drugs stuck? What if his record was ruined forever? What if the kids he mentored now saw him as just another black man taken down by the system? The weight crushed his chest until breathing hurt. Then came the first real twist that no one expected in those raw hours. A rookie dispatcher who had watched the live Bodycam feed quietly copied the files to a thumb drive before supervisors could bury them. She slipped the drive to a trusted community lawyer at 6 a.m. outside the precinct. That single act lit the fuse. The lawyer, a sharp young sister named Denise Washington, reviewed the footage in her car and whispered one word, "Gotcha." She immediately called the ACLU and the local news station. The planted baggie, the smug grins, the deliberate distraction, all of it was now in safe hands. But Keith still sat in the cell, unaware, while his family waited outside in the growing crowd. Marlene finally got to see him through the glass at the bail hearing. She pressed her palm against the partition, eyes locked on his. "We're fighting this, baby. The whole church is behind you." Keith nodded, throat too tight for words. The bail was set at $50,000, money they didn't have. The family scraped together what they could, mortgaging the house, borrowing from deacons. The system squeezed even tighter, reminding them who really held the power. Outside, the crowd grew to over 100. Signs waved high, "Veterans deserve respect," and "Stop planting leaves." The smell of coffee from volunteers mixed with the tension in the air. Reporters arrived with cameras rolling. Questions flew like bullets. Why target a man who spent his life protecting these streets? Why 3 officers against 1 unarmed veteran? Why did the body cams show smiles instead of justice? Baltimore held its breath. The city that had seen too many broken promises now watched one more black man, one more veteran, one more church pillar get dragged through the mud. But the real storm was still building. The copied footage was already moving through secure channels. Lawyers sharpened their knives. The department scrambled to contain the damage. Keith Harlan's life hung in the balance, and every second in that cell felt like another nail in the coffin of trust between the people and the police. Would the system finally crack under the weight of its own lies? Or would Keith Harlan become just another statistic? Another good man destroyed so 3 officers could keep their badges and their secrets. The answer was coming fast, and when it hit, the entire department would feel the earthquake. The investigation ignited the moment Denise Washington slid that thumb drive into the hands of the ACLU attorney early the next morning. Baltimore's streets still smelled of last night's rain and protest coffee as the raw body cam and CCTV files hit the conference room table. Lawyers huddled under harsh fluorescent lights, the click of keyboards mixing with the low murmur of outrage. Every frame confirmed what the neighborhood already knew in its bones. Keith Harlan had been set up. The planted baggie, the deliberate distraction, the arrogant grins frozen in high definition. The truth spilled out like blood on concrete. Detectives from internal affairs were forced into the room by noon. The chief himself sat stone, faced while the footage rolled. Sergeant Carlos Ramirez's smirk filled the giant screen, teeth flashing as he held up the drugs he had never found in the car. The audio caught every muttered word. "This'll shut him up." Thompson and Hale shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as the timestamps proved the hand-off happened behind Keith's back. The corner store CCTV angle sealed it. Clear as daylight, Thompson's pocket to glove box in under 2 seconds. The room went dead silent. One veteran detective whispered, "This ain't policing. This is hunting." Keith sat in his cell when the first lawyer arrived, the smell of cheap institutional soap still clinging to his skin. Denise Washington slid into the chair across the glass, eyes fierce. "Mr. Harlan, we have them. Every camera caught the plant. Your activism made you a target, but those cameras just made them stupid." Keith's hands trembled for the first time since the cuffs. Tears he had held back all night finally broke free. He thought of Marlene's palm against the glass, of his daughters driving through the night, of the kids on the block who called him Uncle Keith. The weight that had crushed his chest lifted just enough for hope to rush in like fresh air after a sandstorm. The twist hit harder than anyone expected. During the deep dive into station logs, investigators uncovered Ramirez's own dirty secret, missing evidence from 3 previous busts. Small amounts of drugs had vanished from the property locker weeks earlier. The planted baggie on Keith wasn't just payback for his testimony, it was cover. Ramirez had been using the activist as a shield to hide his own theft. Thompson confessed first in a closed room, voice shaking, admitting Hale had only followed orders. He said it would be quick. 1 night, 1 caller, and the heat would die down. The young officer broke down when the video played again, realizing his career was over before it truly began. Word leaked by evening. Local news vans circled the precinct like sharks. Headlines screamed across every screen in Sandtown. Bodycam bombshell, veteran set up by police. The smell of printer ink and fresh protest signs filled the air as the crowd outside swelled to 200. Church members held candles, flames flickering against the dusk, singing hymns that carried straight through the precinct walls. Keith heard them from his cell. The sound wrapped around his heart like his mother's arms decades ago. He closed his eyes and saw the desert again, sand in his teeth, comrades at his side, but this time the enemy wore badges instead of foreign uniforms. Marlene stood on the precinct steps at sunset, microphone in hand, voice steady despite the tears. "My husband served this country, he serves this city, and they tried to bury him for speaking truth." The cameras ate it up. Tamika and Latoya flanked her, arms linked, the 3 women forming a wall no lie could break. Inside, Keith pressed his forehead to the cold glass during the next visit. "Baby, they're cracking," Marlene whispered. "The truth is out. Hold on." His chest swelled with a mix of rage and gratitude so fierce it hurt to breathe. Yet another revelation dropped like a hammer at midnight. A second thumb drive surfaced from a neighbor's Ring camera across the street. It showed Ramirez high, fiving Thompson right after the arrest, the words, "One less loudmouth," caught on audio. The department tried to bury it, but the ACLU already had copies. The bias was undeniable. Keith's activism against racial profiling, his petitions, his church-led marches, all of it had painted a target on his back. The system wasn't just broken. It was rotten from the inside, and 3 officers had just handed the city the proof on a silver platter. Keith lay on the thin mattress that night, the distant chant of justice for Keith drifting through the vents. His mind raced through every patrol he had ever walked, every kid he had steered away from corners, every Sunday sermon he had given about forgiveness and fighting the good fight. The fear that had clawed at him for 24 hours began to turn into something sharper, righteous fury. Not for himself alone, but for every veteran who came home to this, every black man who dared speak up. The cameras had done what years of complaints never could. They had forced the truth into the light. The investigation raced forward through the night. Warrants flew. Phones were seized. The entire shift that night was pulled in for questioning. Baltimore held its breath once more. The department's darkest secrets were spilling out faster than they could plug the leaks. And at the center of it all sat 158-year-old veteran, hands still raw from cuffs, but spirit rising like the sun over the row houses. Would the revelations finally bring the whole rotten structure crashing down? Or would the system find one last way to protect its own and leave Keith Harlan broken in its wake? The answer was barreling toward the courtroom, and the city would never be the same. Type justice in the comments if these Bodycam revelations make your blood boil. Have you ever seen the system turn on its own protectors? Drop your city and your story below. I'm reading every single comment tonight. By early 2018, justice finally rolled through the Baltimore courtroom like a long overdue storm. The trial lasted only 9 days, but every minute felt like years to Keith Harlan. The Bodycam and CCTV footage played on the big screen for the jury, and the room went silent each time Sergeant Ramirez's arrogant grin flashed across the frame. The planted baggie, the whispered, "This'll shut him up," the deliberate hand off, every piece of evidence landed like a hammer. The judge, a stern black woman who had seen too many cases like this, didn't hesitate. Ramirez and Thompson were found guilty of evidence tampering, perjury, and civil rights violations. They were stripped of their badges on the spot, faces pale as the cuffs clicked around their wrists for the very first time. Derek Hale received a lesser charge and immediate suspension. The department settled Keith's lawsuit for nearly $2 million before the ink on the verdict was even dry. Keith Harlan walked out of that courthouse a free man in March 2018, the same salt and pepperbeard now streaked with fresh gray, but his head held higher than ever. The humid Baltimore spring air tasted sweeter than any desert breeze he remembered from his army days. Marlene waited on the steps with Tamika and LaToya, tears flowing freely as the family collapsed into one long embrace. The smell of her lavender lotion mixed with the cheers rising from over 500 supporters who had lined the sidewalk. Church members waved signs that simply read, "Truth wins." Keith raised one fist to the sky and whispered the same prayer that had carried him through the cell, "The Lord is my shepherd." This time the words rang with victory instead of desperation. The long-term effects rippled far beyond one man. Mount Zion Baptist Church saw attendance double overnight. Young boys who once hung on corners now showed up for Keith's new mentorship program, calling him Pops, with even deeper respect. The $2 million settlement went straight into a community fund that fixed streetlights, funded after-school basketball, and paid for veterans' counseling sessions that the VA had always promised but never delivered. Keith himself never patrolled alone again. He walked those same Fulton Avenue blocks with a small team of church volunteers, clipboard in hand, eyes sharper than before. The nightmares still came some nights, but now they ended with him waking to Marlene's hand on his shoulder and the knowledge that the system had been forced to blink. The department felt the earthquake immediately. By late 2018, the Baltimore police implemented mandatory bodycam audits, independent oversight boards, and new training on racial bias that every officer had to complete or lose their job. 24 other cases from the previous 5 years were quietly reopened and dismissed when similar planting patterns surfaced. The chief resigned under pressure. The city council passed reforms named after Keith himself, the Harlan Transparency Act, requiring every traffic stop in high-crime neighborhoods to be reviewed by civilian panels. For the first time in decades, black residents of Sandtown, Winchester felt something they had almost forgotten: a sliver of real trust. Not perfect, not complete, but a crack in the wall that had stood too long. Yet the story never let Keith forget the cost. He still carried the scar on his wrist from those cuffs, a thin white line that itched when it rained. He still saw the faces of Ramirez and Thompson in his quiet moments and wondered how many other good men had been buried before the cameras finally forced the truth out. The system had tried to crush a veteran, a husband, a church pillar, a neighborhood guardian, all because he dared speak up for fairness. It had failed. But the fight had taken pieces of him that could never be replaced. His daughters still checked on him every single night. Marlene still prayed a little harder at bedtime. And the kids on the block now learned 2 lessons instead of one: the serve your community and never trust the badge that forgets who it's supposed to protect. Baltimore changed, but the deeper wound remained. Across the country, similar body cam scandals continued to surface, reminding every man watching that one planted baggie could still destroy a life if the cameras weren't rolling. Keith Harlan stood as living proof that sometimes the system gets caught. Sometimes justice arrives before it's too late. But the real question he asked every Sunday from the pulpit still hung heavy in the air. How many Keith Harlans never made it to the courtroom because the footage was lost? The cameras had spoken. The jury had listened. 2 officers lost everything they thought they owned. 1 veteran got his life back. And the city learned, at least for a while, that even the strongest walls can crack when good men refuse to stay silent. Type justice in the comments if you believe body cams are the only thing keeping some departments honest. Have you ever watched a good man fight the system and win? Drop your city below. I rate every comment. If this story of a veteran, a church, and a city that almost broke him hit you in the chest, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. More true stories of real justice, real pain, and real comebacks are dropping every week. Stay strong out there. This fight ain't over.